Hey. I'm just really delighted to be introducing Maggie Nelson tonight. I think she's just one of the most extraordinary writers around. Bluets, Art of Cruelty, these sort of extraordinary books that braid together multiple strands and that think with extraordinary fluidity and spaciousness around ideas that can often seem sewn up, impossible. She unknits them in these very graceful and mesmerising, exciting, passionate ways. I think she's a very, very good thing. So what we're going to do tonight is have a conversation, but first of all, Maggie's going to read a little bit from the Argonauts.
I will, yeah. Thank you, Olivia. I'm thrilled to be doing this event with Olivia, whose writing I admire a lot, and with whom I think, is this on? You're all good? Yeah? With whom I think we have a lot of overlapping points of kinship. So, and I was ill when I was going to do Olivia the favor of interviewing her in Los Angeles, which is where I have flown in from, and I feel very badly about that. And I thought for sure she would not want to now do the other half, which was do the London event. And so I'm very grateful that you did anyway, and so I owe her, and I also I think owe Olivia for. Writing one of my favorite pieces of writing about my book, which was the very first thing that came out about the Argonauts. It made me feel as though no matter what happened next, it was all fine. And somebody had understood the book thoroughly. It was all I wanted. It's a great gift if that's the first thing you see. But also in that same piece, she had kind of called upon the UK to publish my book, which was, in publishing circles like a real... I don't know what you want to call it. I was going to say an open hand, or maybe more of a whip or something, but it made it happen, is the point, I think.
It was lashed.
Yes, exactly. And that was also really meaningful to me because now I get to come here and meet all of you and have the first UK edition of this book. So I'll just read a little bit from the beginning so that we can talk, which I think will be more, or at least equally interesting. And I'll just read from the start of the book. So October 2007. The Santa Ana winds are shredding the bark off the eucalyptus trees in long white stripes. A friend and I risk the widowmakers by having lunch outside, during which she suggests I tattoo the words "hard to get" across my knuckles, as a reminder of this pose's possible fruits. Instead, the words "I love you" come tumbling out of my mouth in an incantation the first time you fuck me in the ass, my face smashed against the cement floor of your dank and charming bachelor pad. You had Malloy by your bedside and a stack of cocks in a shadowy, unused shower stall. Does it get any better? What's your pleasure, you asked, then stuck around for an answer. Before we met, I had spent a lifetime devoted to Wittgenstein's idea that the inexpressible is contained inexpressibly in the expressed. This idea gets less airtime than his more reverential, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But it is, I think, the deeper idea. Its paradox is quite literally why I write, or how I feel able to keep writing. For it does not feed or exalt any angst one may feel about the incapacity to express in words that which eludes them. It does not punish what can be said for what by definition it cannot be. Nor does it ham it up by miming a constricted throat. Lo, what I would say were words good enough. Words are good enough. It is idle to fault a net for having holes, my encyclopedia notes. In this way, you can have your empty church with a dirt floor swept clean of dirt and your spectacular stained glass gleaming by the cathedral rafters both, because nothing you say can fuck up the space for God. I have explained this elsewhere, but I'm trying to say something different now. Before long, I learned that you had spent a lifetime equally devoted to the conviction that words are not good enough. Not only not good enough, but corrosive to all that is good, all that is real, all that is flow. We argued and argued on this account, full of fever, not malice. Once we name something, you said, we never see it the same way again. All that is unnameable falls away, gets lost, is murdered. You called this the cookie-cutter function of our minds. You said you knew this, not from shunning language, but from immersion in it, on the screen, in conversation, on stage, on the page. I argued along the lines of Thomas Jefferson and the churches for plethora, for kaleidoscopic shifting, for excess. I insisted that words did more than nominate. I read aloud to you the opening of Philosophical Investigations. Slab, I shouted, slab. For a time I thought I had won. You conceded there might be an okay human animal, even if that animal used a language, even if its use of language were somehow defining of its humanness, even if humanness itself meant trashing and torching the whole motley, precious planet, along with its and our future. But I changed too. I looked anew at unnameable things, or at least things whose essence is flicker, is flow. I readmitted the sadness of our eventual extinction and the injustice of our extinction of others. I stopped smugly repeating Wittgenstein's line, everything that can be thought at all can be thought clearly, and I wondered anew, can everything be thought? And you, whatever you argued, you never mimed a constricted throat. In fact, you ran at least a lap ahead of me, words streaming in your wake. How could I ever catch up, by which I mean, how could you want me? A day or two after my love pronouncement, now feral with vulnerability, I sent you the passage from Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes, in which Barthes describes how the subject who utters the phrase, I love you, is, quote, like the Argonaut renewing his ship during its voyage without changing its name, end quote. Just as the Argo's parts may be replaced over time, but the boat is still called the Argo. Whenever the lover utters the phrase, I love you, its meaning must be renewed by each use. As, quote, the very task of love and of language is to give to one and the same phrase inflections which will be forever new, end quote. I thought this passage was romantic. You read it as a possible retraction. In retrospect, I guess it was both. You've punctured my solitude, I told you. It had been a useful solitude, constructed as it was around a recent sobriety, long walks to and from the Y through the sordid, bougainvillea-strewn backstreets of Hollywood, evening drives up and down Mulholland Drive to kill the long nights, and, of course, maniacal bouts of writing, learning to address no one. But the time for its puncturing had come. I feel I can give you everything without giving myself away, I whispered to you in your basement bed. If one does one's solitude right, this is the prize. A few months later, we spent Christmas together in a hotel in downtown San Francisco. I had booked the room for us online in the hope that my booking of the room and our time in the room would make you love me forever. It turned out to be one of those hotels that book for cheap because it was undergoing an astonishingly rude renovation and because it was smack in the middle of the cracked-out Tenderloin. No matter, we had other business to attend to. Sun filtered through the ratty Venetian blinds, just barely obscuring the construction workers hammering away outside as we attended to it. Just don't kill me, I said as you took off your leather belt, smiling. After lunch, my friend who suggested the hard-to-get tattoo invites me to her office, where she offers to Google you on my behalf. She's going to see if the internet reveals a preferred pronoun for you, since despite or due to the fact that we're spending every free moment in bed together and already talking about moving in, I cannot bring myself to ask. Instead, I've become a quick study in pronoun avoidance. The key is training your ear not to mind hearing a person's name over and over again. You must learn to take cover in grammatical cul-de-sacs, relax into an orgy of specificity. You must learn to tolerate an instance beyond the two, precisely at the moment of attempting to represent a partnership, a nuptial even. Deleuze, Parnay say, nuptials are the opposite of a couple. There are no longer binary machines, question-answer, masculine-feminine, man-animal, etc. This could be what a conversation is, simply the outline of a becoming. Expert as one may become at such a conversation, to this day it remains almost impossible for me to make an airline reservation or negotiate with my human resources department on our behalf without flashes of shame or befuddlement. It's not really my shame or my befuddlement. It's more like I'm ashamed for or simply pissed off at the person who keeps making all the wrong presumptions and has to be corrected, but who cannot be corrected because the words are not good enough. How can the words not be good enough? Lovesick on the floor of my friend's office, I squint up at her as she scrolls through an onslaught of bright information I do not want to see. I want the you no one else can see, the you so close the third person never need apply. Look, here's a quote from John Waters saying, "She's very handsome." So maybe you should use she. I mean, it's John Waters. That was years ago. I roll my eyes from the floor. Things might have changed. When making your Butch buddy film by hook or by crook, you and your co-writer Silas decided that the Butch characters would call each other he and him. But in the outer world of grocery stores and authority figures, people would call them she and her. The point was not that if the outer world were schooled appropriately, RE, the characters' preferred pronouns, everything would become right as rain. Because if the outsiders called the characters he, it would be a different kind of he. Words change depending on who speaks them. There is no cure. The answer isn't just to introduce new words, boy, BOI, cisgendered, androphag, etc., and then set out to reify their meanings, though obviously there is power and pragmatism here. One must also become alert to the multitude of possible uses, possible contexts, the wings with which each word can fly. Like when you whisper, "You're just a hole, letting me fill you up." Like when I say, "husband." I think that's all I want to do.
These lovely threads running through it about language, about what you can do with language, about what we're trying to report on in the world and whether it's reported on-able. And I've written down other questions, but actually I kind of want to start with that, like, are words good enough? Where are you with that now?
Yeah, it's funny because, I mean, this book definitely...
Because it's a live question for a writer, and I think we don't kind of pose it often enough.
I mean, it depends, I guess, good enough for what,
Good enough as in good enough mother.
Good enough as in good enough mother. I mean, yes, I think they're good enough insofar as... I mean, I still believe the Wittgensteinian proposition at the beginning about the expressed containing the inexpressible. And I think, like I say, it's why I write, because, I say a lot of things in this book, or any book, you write a lot of lines and you say things. Duh. But you're also, when you're writing a book or, literature, you're trying to make something happen that's bigger than the sum of its parts. You're trying to make and that thing is fairly inexpressible. You only know it as a writer intuitively when you keep re-editing your draft and feeling the pace, or feeling you get at it by individual word by individual word, individual sentence by individual sentence, but you kind of keep your eye on the prize in a very puffy way, which is that if everything is good enough at every moment, maybe I will have made the thing, that does something more than the individual parts. And I don't think you can aim to do the latter thing, even though probably all of us as writers would like to. But I think you can only aim at the former thing. I mean, at least I can. That's all I can do. So I think, are they good enough in terms of, do they hold all of the experience of consciousness? And no. Not at all, and certainly that conversation about love. A lot of people, and I'm very grateful for this, have said, what a wonderful love letter to your partner Harry you've written, and I'm like, yeah, well, tell it, Harry. But what I more mean by that is that, like, written words, like for a public or something, like that's another use value of words. That's another kind of Wittgensteinian, scene of exchange. That scene of exchange, like what I'm doing with, you all right now, is not the scene of exchange with the beloved, which is not the scene of exchange with the beloved over day after day or whatever. So I think that question of being good enough is like, you don't just do it once and you did it with language. So I think it's also,
this perpetual
ongoing
reinvention, and resolving of the same problem. I mean,
that's why Bart uses the phrase, let me think about, if you said I love you today, all the different tones, love you, like love you, there's so many different, it's this...
And so many lovers to whom it's been said.
Yeah, and, Bart says it's always a demand, no matter how it's posed,
That might say more about him than...
It indeed might say more about him, but I think that those notions are really... they're really interesting just to get into. And what's amazing about books too is their use value changes. Like I say, words change depending on the context. There is no cure, but that's also true of any, as a book travels in the world, its function changes in different contexts as well.
And actually, I've read this book lots of times now, and I was reading it again the last couple of days, and it's a different book to me again. There are things I hadn't noticed. I think structurally it's very interesting because the first time you read it, you're reading it for narrative. You're looking to see what happens to the characters, and it felt much more digressive to me initially than when I come back to it now. I think this is a very, very tightly packed book. It's incredibly constructed, and nothing's wasted, nothing's digressive.
Oh, that's
really.
nice.
But
I mean, to me it feels like that. So whenever I read somebody or someone says it's like a digressive style, I always think, well, you should see the cutting room floor if you.
But I mean, each thing leads into the next. Like this stalker story, I didn't understand why the stalker story was there the first few readings, and this time I think I'd been thinking about paranoia anyway, and there it is. The sense is completely there. Okay, so There's a scene midway where I think it's actually where you and Harry are hashing out what you've said about him in the book, but you say something that I really liked and that I thought was interesting to start with, which is, I do not yet understand the relationship between happiness and writing, or writing and holding. And I just wanted to start there, like what sense are you making? Because that seemed to me one of the fundamental strands of the book, right? It's about happiness, it's about holding, it's about writing, it's about how you reconcile those different things in your life, in a life.
I mean, I think for a number of years, these two books, Jane and The Red Parts, are about my aunt's, the murder of my mother's sister, and those two books, and then, we could just go down the list, The Art of Cruelty, you can tell what that's about by the title, and then it's not a how-to guide, The Art of War, although it might be, and then Bluets is. It was supposed to be my big book about pleasure and beauty, but it ended up being all about pain. But I mean, I think that for a while, my kind of calling card as a writer became, writing about difficult things, and in The Red Parts in particular, but very difficult, like kind of dramatizing a reckoning with looking at, in this case, say, this mutilated family member's body and violence towards women in general. Looking literally in that book, it's discussed as moving literally towards a wound, like kind of joking about the self-help, like circling the wound, but then moving towards it. But, because it was a courtroom book with a lot of projections of harm done, it really became about just staring at, some of the worst things. So all of this is to say that I like a challenge. So it seemed to me like it wasn't like I had a handle on writing about darkness or depression or cruelty or violence, but I didn't understand the relationship between writing and holding, or being good enough, or writing and happiness, and they didn't seem like, writing didn't make me especially happy to do. It didn't make me unhappy to do, but I wasn't. So I think, and that conversation, I think about, from the quote you pulled, it has a corollary in kind of queer theory with what's sometimes roughly discussed as like theories of like queer pessimism, queer shame, queer negativity, and then queer optimism. A friend of mine wrote a book called Queer Optimism, and a kind of conversation about if for a long time a lot of queer theory had been about making shame out of necessity because it was dumped on queers, making it into your badge, that was worthwhile, and it provoked a lot of theorizing about the way to do that, which we all need to learn how to do, wear our shames as our badges. But I think that with this conversation about kind of assimilation and homonormativity, and the kind of when some of the major obstacles posed by discrimination might be taken off the table, there's kind of a flood of kind of not that marriage and breeding or whatnot is going to make you happy, but more like what can we still value about queer subcultures that was forged in those fires of shame and difficulty when we have fought and are winning some major victories of taking some of those obstacles off the table. So I think that, so I guess for me personally as a writer, and then also with the content, it made, with my history as a writer with those books, and then with the kind of this current questions, it made sense to try and write a book about happiness, quote unquote.
But then, it's interesting because you know, this is a book that collapses binary after binary, but really more demonstrates how entangled all of those binaries are.
Yeah.
And it seemed like one of the binaries that you handle really interestingly is cruelty versus love, that they aren't separate spaces. And you know, like I was thinking about the Catherine O.P. breastfeeding photo with she's the cut of pervert in her chest and she's breastfeeding. So you know, that seemed like a sort of icon of it, but also the extraordinary section at the end where you're giving birth and Harry's with his mother who's dying, and there's that sense of, you know, people can be very cosy and gooey about giving birth, pregnant ladies giving birth, having a baby, this sort of cartoonish narrative, and you make it fucking I mean, there's a line that, but not terrifying, like that sounds painful, more it's in a place of awe in which the Red Parts is also situated, this place that's sort of between worlds. And I think Harry says it specifically in his section of like, this is a space at the edge of the universe where the doors are open, and you know, that comes up in the Red Parts too. That place feels like a Maggie Nelson kind of territory.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated happiness and it's a complicated violence.
Yeah, I mean, not to be too like sour grapes with like high class problems, but I remember like the New York Times ran the review of the book. It said, "A pregnancy brings a critic back to her body" was the title. And I remember thinking, that's really strange, because if you'd read anything I'd ever written, you'd know that like I've been interested in certain things for a long time, like exactly like what you're saying. I mean, I think, and I think that
the extremity of the body is kind of always there in different ways.
And I think the question about words being good enough, I mean, I'm interested in the banal and writing the daily, but I'm also interested in, you know, while we were sitting downstairs and Elaine Scarry's The Body in Pain was strategically maybe placed on the table. But you know, her theory there about torture, like she's nodding, but her theory about torture and pain, you know, being a test case for the, you know, where language falls away, where language is no longer of use, can't be used. I think that the birth and death passages in this book, you know, again, people say like, well, there are no words for, you know, you couldn't describe the pain of childbirth, or you couldn't, you know, describe, well, Harry's not dying, his mother's dying, but I think, you know, again, I like a challenge, so it seemed like, well, I mean, I sometimes wonder whether or not those injunctions are also ways of not having certain experiences, like giving it a go, you know, like why not try? And so, I mean, the birth story,
well, it's hedged around with taboos as well, isn't it? Because the risk is that you're a narcissistic woman speaking about her embodied experience.
Yeah, and one of the most surprising
like
things in this book of all to me was like how many times people have asked me how I gave myself permission to write that story, given how many birth stories there already are. And I'm always like, show me, tell me, show me them, because like if you're pregnant and like, you know, you might want to read any of them, and there weren't any. Like I mean in literature, not like in Vogue or something, you know. So I mean, I love Vogue. I just mean like you know, something welcomed as part of, you know, a human experience that might be able to be attended to in language, you know. And so it seemed, you know, just worth giving it a go. And then
One of the many, I mean, there's an awful lot that you're doing about gender in this book, but I think one of the really nice things that I found is the at the end of the day, it's human animals. Yeah. And you come back to that a lot, like these two human animals. Yeah. So it kind of it's one of the canny ways of skating away from these sort of working the trap around. Yeah. That seems like a good way of doing it. Yeah. I like it.
Yeah. And I mean, Harry's got okay and animal tattooed on each of so like it's like being okay animal. So it's a kind of it's a family joke, but yeah.
That's nice. A good tattoo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We did. I mean, you just touched.
But
on
I did
it.
want to say one thing. I just want to say about the binaries, because I don't think I really addressed that part of your question, which may or may not really been a question. But I do think that. I mean, I was joking about Bluets, like trying to write about pleasure and then write about pain. But I think that, I mean, that's something that I think is it's become very interesting to me. And I'm sure I'd be curious to know what you feel like in writing about drinking and writing about loneliness. What you touched on is kind of like
fucking cheerful books.
I know, they are in their way. No, they really are. And I think partly why they are, though, is precisely this thing, which is that I think one summons the shadow of one's subject. Excuse me. So, like in the Cruelty book, I ended up writing a lot about compassion and freedom and kind of notions that seem to me the opposite of a sadistic or claustrophobic emotion, because you just, by going into them, so I think in this book, I mean, you're right, it was not an accident that as I attempted to kind of approach Eve Sedgwick's, in particular, theories about happiness dead on near the end, it did become about paranoia, because paranoia, well, she's very interested in Sullivan Tompkins, and Tompkins was a psychologist who paired affects, in affect theory, and so for him, pleasure and shame are a pair, because you have a feeling, and then kind of naturally in your body, something like to kind of keep you away from the excess of like too much pleasure, like something comes up to diminish or corral the other feeling. So shame, corral, like, oh my God, you seem so excited. Oh, too excited. Not, corral the feeling. And so you have, and it's not necessarily value laden, like his description of affect pairs, I think, has been so interesting to people precisely because it's kind of value neutral in a way, because he's more interested in the hydraulics, I guess, of how there's a kind of regulating systems. I think that's interesting if you think about cruelty or compassion or pleasure, shame or pain, or optimism, pessimism, like the way in which
tenderness and brutality.
That the ways in which it's not so much one's here and one's over there, but the way that they intertwine and kind of act as controls on each other in a certain way. And
then another one that seems to run through this book really very deeply is freedom and devotion.
Right.
That should be in opposition, and yet you find all kinds of interesting ways of making them intersect, finding freedoms through devotion that perhaps you hadn't realised were there previously. Although the domestic is always in your book, but yes. And
I was going to say that was one of the things that I was just when I read Olivia's piece on this book, and the last part was about freedom, and I was like, that is so great, because I mean, because this book actually started as a book I wanted to write about devotion and freedom.
You did.
I did, in a totally different idiom that had nothing to do with my home life, for lack of a better word. But then events of my life, I mean, this always happens, right? Like, I was writing a book about the color blue, and then a friend of mine had to get, in a terrible accident and become a quadriparalytic, and I ended up taking care of her that year. And while I was trying to write my book about the color blue, and I was like, oh, this is not what I imagined, like, and how are these things related? But yeah, so in this book, I think that paradigm about freedom and devotion ended up being refracted through presumptions about care being a diminishment of freedom, and the ways in which that did not seem to me to be the case.
Yeah, and I think you make a case for it being much more political than we tend to think of it, that the act of devotion is much more political, much more radically political.
And again, the book, even though it's like about care and devotion in some ways, I feel like I'm always a little bit careful to remind people, lest they get kind of too like, oh, it's just a book about how she's so happy and she found someone she really liked and, smug or whatever. But that the, she's all fine and fair. But the, what was I going to say? It was about, devotion, which is that, there are a lot of instances in this book where the care is not good enough. my partner is adopted, and which is given up at birth, which was a very profound instance of when care is not good enough, and then the care, he got was good enough, but then the question of, there's a lot of, when his mother is sick and moves in with us, we were not able to take care of her adequately.
That's devastating, actually.
Through her cancer, I wouldn't say we were poor caretakers, I would just say we were not, our life was not set up to care for her, and there are just many instances where, I think all of us make hard decisions between when we can give good enough care and when we can't. So I think that conflict of kind of self-care, like, I can't live in a one-bedroom apartment with your mother dying of cancer on the floor. I can't give her care in this environment, which then translates into her only choices to get substandard care somewhere else. Those are the kind of choices that we make all the time, and make ugly to necessary decisions.
But then again, that's another thing that I like about the book, is that it doesn't sort of perform these idealized rites of care. It's not about that. It's about how we actually care in our actual bodies, in our actual lives, with impossible circumstances, which sometimes we can't rise to and sometimes we can. Right? It's complicated. I think bringing Winnicott in at this point would be good. You have this great joke title for the book, which is "Why Winnicott Now?"
Right,
to be like, well, why Winnicott now? Because
right.
we're both very interested in him in lots of levels, and I wanted to know why he seemed to you sort of such an appropriate figure, both for this book but also for this kind of cultural moment.
Well, when I was in grad school, I took a class with Eve Sedgwick, a queer theorist, called Non-Oedipal Models of Psychology, and we kind of did all, everyone from Melanie Klein to Deleuze to Winnicott to just kind of people who just weren't on the Oedipus train, and I think because she was a queer theorist, the subtext of that class was, of course, having an ear out for what Eve would have called more than queer. She would have called them non-homophobic models of psychology. And I think that and she found many in Winnicott, and I think it in part had to do with homophobia may seem off the point. With what I'm going to say, which is more about gender than it is about sexuality, but the notion of good enough mothering. You guys know, and I'm totally, I told Olivia beforehand, I was like, I hate talking about Winnicott, especially in London, because I'm just like the American rube who doesn't know anything about Winnicott, and
Where's the Winnicott
yes, exactly. I know, I'm like shrinking as I talk, but I will say that what that theory came out of, so far as I understand it, was that there are many children who couldn't be cared for during the war and who had to have good enough mothering taken away from their mothers, or their families during the bombings, and that somebody was going to have to be able to do it. Was going to have to be able to adequately hold all those removed children, and I think that gave rise to this notion that it doesn't have to be the mother, gendered as such, who can do good enough holding. And I think that if you live with the parent, Harry, my partner, who's doesn't see himself reflected in versions of motherhood, but also doesn't really see himself reflected in versions of fatherhood, but still feels himself very much to be, as he is, a parent, and parenting and doing that labor, it really can bring into view what those activities are like that are not dependent on the gendered job of the person who does them, which is not to say, this book I feel like tries to do, I'm not sure if it succeeds entirely, but it tries to do, this is kind of the having it both ways thing, which I think is very difficult, but it tries to both explore that space, the non-gendered points of care, especially, and you've written well about this too, but using things like the AIDS crisis, or instances of care that are invisible to people looking for one model of care, and they're missing these huge networks of care that were created that don't resemble systems of kinship people had seen before, because they're full of people who were invisible to them performing those acts of care. So I think on the one hand there's a lot to be done there, and then on the other hand, this is the having it both ways part. I do spend some time with elements of what you might call biological maternity, because I'm interested in how to keep both those things in the bowl, so that you don't have to obliterate the capacities of a body to give birth or breastfeed or whatnot in order to talk about the capacities for a non-gendered space of doing.
But you also don't have to reify it in a sense that removes the other experiences, which is something that feminism at large needs to learn. Yeah,
so I think it was the kind of so there were a lot of people think, I don't know what the discourse is like here per se, but a lot, what do you say?
It's the same.
It's the same, okay, great. But a lot of people think that there is a, or at least the media likes to make a lot of this kind of incontrovertible fight between, a kind of a non-transphobic future and one in which anything about materiality of the body and gender can be addressed, like that they can never happen at the same time. So I think in some ways I was just trying to put something out also as literature that could also just say, like, not only are these not like, trans exclusionary radical feminists fighting trans people, like, and not only are they not always like over there, like sometimes you can have people like in the same kitchen table who are like talking about things and exchanging ideas about what it means to be a gender or whatever, and that conversation brings us together. It doesn't always bring us apart.
And actually we can tolerate dissent and disagreement.
We can also tolerate paradox.
Well, we can't a lot of the time, but
a lot of the time, like that there's a lot of, which is why I, quote, the wonderful Denise Riley, who says, the category of woman is one on which feminism, it's the shifting sands on which feminism has always swayed, and from Sojourner Truth saying, ain't I a woman, even though I pull loads, and then I'm whipped on the fields, like, and I don't resemble your white womanhood, but ain't I a woman? It's just always been a category that has had the ain't I a woman element of it as a constitutive piece. So it's a mistake, I think, to think that in any particular episodic discussion that the sands are fundamentally changed.
I think that's so crucial. How are we doing for time? Someone who's getting towards audience questions. Okay, well, I've got one more question which relates to that. I was reading an interview, a bad interview, I'd say, I won't say which interview it was, with you, where the interviewer was kind of agitated about why you weren't more concrete about Harry's transition, and there's something about, I wanted a concrete paragraph explaining who Harry became, which seemed like a complete point missing. I know you know. A complete point missing. Of what the entire project of the book was. I don't want to talk about that. I'm not particularly interested in that. But I've been thinking about it a lot today, and it made me think about. I'm kind of obsessed with Eve's paranoid reading versus reparative reading, and what reparative reading means really. But it struck me that the interviewer's desire to have that clarified, to have a sort of before and after notion of what somebody's gender transition is a paranoid reading, and it's a paranoid reading that we're culturally obsessed with right now, right? The sort of bathroom bills, the stuff about is somebody biologically female, this sort of horrific language that seems very invested in finding out the truth of what a person is, as if that will, as if genitalia will tell you anything, as if anything will tell you anything. But it also made me think how much this book, what you're doing in terms of tolerating fluidity, is a reparative reading, which I feel like is something that I've been trying to make sense of for a very long time. And I wonder just what it's obviously a concept you think about a lot as well. Reparative
reading, which is in that.
I mean, I still don't know what she even meant by it.
I know.
Like,
I was going to say that, like, there's a lot of conversation about what Cedric means about reparative reading. I mean, I think, the line of hers I quote in here is when she says the paradox of saying, I think she's talking about Jack Smith, for those of you who know Jack Smith, but saying like how strange it is that often the most paranoid people can develop the most reparative, artistic practices or something, and you can like meet them and be like, oh my God, that guy's crazy, paranoid, whatever. How is the art making me feel so possible and free and whatever? And like, but again, that's kind of back to the hydraulics of like how we, what we're able to offer each other that we may not be able to like offer ourselves all the time, So I think that
I'm writing about Jack Smith's
archive
really? Right now.
Fascinating.
There's a lot of paranoia in
yes,
how that
a lot.
was handled.
Just like a stunning amount. And I think, but I like your thought very much that the reifying categories or a kind of obsession with transition is a paranoid mode because, many, many times while going around with this book, I've had the sentence in my head, which I don't say, but I'll say during the night where I'm always like, it's not the crying game, okay? Because like people,
the big reveal.
People ask me, and I'm kind of like, do you get out much? Like, because a lot of people live in a world where you might fuck somebody when you're not totally sure what their gender is. It happens, It's like, but I'm gathering that some people don't. So I've learned that's true. But I don't know. That was all college was to me. It was like. Was that, but anyway, that was a long time ago. But I think that like there are ways in which, that there's like a, like when you're having a baby and people say, "Oh, do you know what it is?" And it always took me a minute to be like, "Oh, they mean what's its gender?" Because I'd be like, "It's a human baby," and then I'd be like, "No, that's not what they mean." But I think that, but the phrase, "Do you know what it is?" began to stitch in my head to me this paranoia with like the way that we attach gender as like the ultimate category of what it is, and so I think that it's the good news is that that if you start living or seeing a different way, it's a surprisingly easy habit to shake. It's not actually as hard as people think that it is, but I think. But you have to go through that either by yourself, by a reckoning with your own failure to always be a single being, or by being close to people who, or being in a culture in which people flicker in and out of many things. So I think it's but I like that idea that. And I don't know, I think again, we're kind of back to where we started about writing books, like in terms of doing something that some being greater than its parts, that I don't think you can try and make reparative work, No. I think if it's helpful to somebody else, like with my books, whenever I've had the really kind of hitting bottom feeling that this is all for me, God damn it, or like, I'm just gonna, write this, like a real slash and burn feeling, a kind of very closed narcissistic slash and burn feeling as a writer. Those moments have usually been the ones people have told me are most meaningful to them.
Specificity.
Yeah, and I think just like, people always say, who are you writing for? And I'm like, I think, again, like if you're just very focused on the project and having it be what it needs to be, then people who need to find it will find it. But I don't know that offering reparative experience is something that can be, or at least for me, addressed head on. I don't even know if Jack Smith, I doubt he was.
I don't think he was thinking that in the least. He was just like, hey, leopard print there.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's us who finds it. I think it comes to the. It comes from attention as well. Yeah. Okay. You guys, we're going to switch to audience questions.
Yeah, I'll just say my last thing about which I love about this quote, just because Gertrude Stein, when people said like, why don't you have commas in your writing, and she said, God, it's so bossy to tell people when to stop or breathe. Why don't they just figure out by themselves where they want to breathe in the middle of a sentence? And to me, I love this line because it was very like. it epitomized Stein's paradox, which is that, like, on the one hand, that's like radically a liberating idea, like, breathe when you want, you know, what do I care, you know, like, and on the other hand, you know, you can't get through a Steinian sentence without feeling kind of, you know, tyrannized by her sentence structure. So it's kind of offering radical liberty and radical disciplinary measures simultaneously. So.
Hi, thank you. That was wonderful. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between sex and language in your work, and kind of sex not necessarily being described just as a physical act, but as something sort of ecstatic or something that might bring forth language with it.
Great. Well, you know, it's funny. I actually feel kind of prudish in that, like, I don't really. I'm a great student and lover of a lot of sex writing. You know, it's like a field of great interest to me. But I've never tried to do. I've never tried to do sex writing so far as I understand it. Like, I'm thinking about, like, I don't know if you guys know Bruce Benderson, but he has this great book, The Romanian, where there's this long description of, like, cum on the eyelash. On, like, you know, from, like, the Romanian hustler that, you know, is like after he's ejaculated on him, and he's talking about what it looks like to look at the room through the kind of kaleidoscope of cum. And, like, I mean, to me, that paragraph is very emblematic of, like, what I think of as sex writing, kind of like just really spending some time with it, you know. And I don't do that very often. I think in this book and in Bluets a little bit, they're more, this sounds really nerdy, but just forgive me, but they're more kind of experiments with, you know, people talk about, like, Latinate and Germanic words back to back and how you can get this effect of kind of like the Latinate's very, like, you know, a flow and whatever, then you say a word like fuck and it has a different, you know, sound. And I think that I'm a little bit more involved with the language experiment of those tones than I am in, like, just going all in for describing the ecstasis of sex. But, you know, hopefully it'll be a long life and I can keep trying. And but I think that there is I mean, I was actually thinking, I was rereading Olivia's book, The Lonely City, terrific, amazing book, and this is not why it's terrific and amazing, but she quotes a part of The Art of Cruelty about meat making. And I was thinking, and it was a really inventive and interesting, I thought, use of that. But in that chapter about meat in The Art of Cruelty, I'm talking about and the pleasures of being made meat, like losing subjectivity in a sense, you know, through sex. But I say, and you quote, like, the problem is, you know, you have to have lived your life enough not as meat to know the difference, you know. So if you're continually objectified or victimized or whatnot, there's not going to be any great frisson in letting go of that. But I do think that, you know, someone once called this book like a bottom manifesto, and that seemed totally fine to me.
It totally is.
I think it totally is, and I think that it's and I think. But there is something I'm getting at somewhere in this weird triangle I'm now making for you, where you've got, like, the Romanian cum eyelash here and meat making here, and I don't know, something about the Argonauts over here. I'm going to stop. But I think that, but I do think that, yeah, I'll just stop there. But
Good question.
Yeah, exactly.
This is a question, I guess, about autobiography. And I was just wondering if you could confirm the suspicion that I had about your writing, because it seems to me like that your work in this book, and maybe, you know, the work of other writers like Wayne Kestenbaum and Ben Lerner, and I guess Eileen Miles, that distinguishes your work as a memoirist, you know, a writer and memoirist, from other instances of writing a memoir is the New York school. And I just wonder, I mean, like, you know, from Frank O'Hara's personism right through to Eileen Miles's work. So I guess maybe, yeah, I mean, is that an important touchstone for you?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book about the New York School called Women, the New York School and Other True Abstractions. And it was interesting, actually. I was talking this morning to an interviewer who was asking me about what I thought about the term confessional writing. And I was actually saying, I said, well, you know, I've thought and written about that a lot, but I said, you know, when I hit Frank O'Hara and he had, you know, personism, which he actually first said he wanted to call personalism, but then or he found out there was like already like a self-help movement called personalism or something, so we had to go with personism. But the kind of joke of personism was like, you know, that you could just pick up the phone and call somebody as opposed to writing the poem, but that there was some kind of, you know, equality of impulse or something between that kind of ease of communication, whereas the confessional scenario is, you know, obviously an incredibly fraught, you know, very fraught, i.e. like partitioned scenario where you're unburdening something that's very private. And I think that the kind of New York School comfort with, I mean, whether it's in Frank O'Hara, whether it's like with cruising or whether it's with just walking the streets, I mean, a lot that Olivia writes about with David Bonarovich and other things in The Lonely City, like the kind of public living and the performance of the private and public that doesn't presume a privatized confessional space, but rather presumes this continuum, is very important to me. And I think it's why I don't really respond so well with the questions about like how do you write so personally or something, because I think it just feels to me like an easier flow than other people might be imagining. And I do think the New York School is probably part of that. And I don't know if it has to be the New York School proper. I mean, I could be just describing a kind of Flannery or urbanity. I think about, I mean, I don't know if this book is big here, but Jane Jacobs' book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, just kind of about urban planning. I'm sure you probably read that. Yeah. You know, like, but her discussions of, you live in London, Yule, so you know, like the distances between like, you know, between like, I have a neighbor and like I see them take out their trash and we kind of know each other, but I'm not going to like puncture their space by saying, oh, what's in your trash bin this morning? You know, but you these kind of negotiated relations as we move through the world, I think is to me very related to forms of writing and performing this often. But were you saying, I'm curious, that Ben Lerner and Eileen Miles and I can't remember your first one, but that they were also New York School related, or you think this? Yeah. Wayne Custom, yes, definitely. Yeah.
It's just like it seems that you have the sense of sincerity, but you're also not enshrining a stable subject to it, right?
Yeah. I mean, a long time ago when I mostly wrote poetry, people would say like, you know, the poets you like, whatever, and I always felt like a weird combination of like my Sylvia Plath and Frank O'Hara love were like totally equal. And it felt kind of like that weird strain, whatever that is, you know, of just kind of melodramatic darkness and totally, you know, joie de vivre sociality seemed really normal to me as a coupling, you know. So yeah.
I might just throw something into that as well. I was chairing an event with Chris Kraus last week, and she got asked a question about confessional writing, as if she'd sort of invented it with I Love Dick, and her answer was like, have you guys read the New York School? Like, there's a lineage here, and I thought that was interesting, that we can sometimes forget that it's a really long way of people talking in both heartfelt and ironized ways about themselves.
Yeah, and also just like, when I'm very happy because it's self-aggrandizing and people say like, oh, it seems like you invented a genre or something, but when you know so much, all of your heroes in the genre that you're writing in, you know, from like Montaigne to, you know, Hervé Goubert to like, you know, people that you just love, you know, Roland Barthes, obviously, this whole book is like a lover's discourse, you know, or Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes, like mirror in a way. It seems silly to talk about like writing in a new genre. It seems like people just have to kind of like shift what they thought of as the canon of personal writing and look at a different canon, you know.
More questions? Are there more questions?
I've got to apologise in advance because I've got a bit of cold, so I might lose the train of thought.
No worries.
I was wondering about, this might be a tangent, just sort of leading up what you were talking about with confessional writing. How do you think of technology in terms of your writing, particularly in the way that it's allowed some of those gender binaries to be broken down with sort of reassignment surgery, but also, particularly in this book, how, I mean, it's something that could happen before, but it's sort of the ease of reappropriating other texts and sort of making it more seamless. And then also, because I was also like Chris Krauss talking about new modes of confessional writing that are sort of enabled by blogging or Facebook or Twitter, something like that.
That's an interesting question. So when you're saying technology, you're kind of putting together like bodily technologies and then virtual technologies, like both. I mean, I'm just asking, kind of like
yeah. I guess just in a really broad sense, as a sort of tool, or something that enables something else. So yes. Yeah, that's not very helpful. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. I mean, I think. I mean, I talk about a little bit in this book that I'm not. I'm a little technophobic. So I think it's an interesting moment where, like, again, like, since I feel like the models for the kind of writing that I'm doing in here, I mean, very specifically the marginal citations, which are taken from Barth's The Neutral, because I'm often using old models, there can be a kind of dissonance when people say like, oh, Maggie's writing books like for the Tumblr era, or something, and you're like, I am? Like, what's Tumblr? And so it's unnerving in a way. I mean, and I've thought about it because I've thought, I mean, I think it's kind of what you're related a little bit to what Olivia was saying about digression versus like making this object. I guess, to me, because I work a lot in ways that might not always be successful or apparent, but because I do work a lot on the logic of the whole book. Like when people tell me like they taught Bluets in like a class about collage or something, like I'm glad for it. It doesn't bother me because that's great teaching the book, but like the notion of like a simultaneity of collage as opposed to like sequence is really, it's a meaningful difference to me, and I don't really do collage work. I think of them as more kind of experimental narratives meant to be read from front to back. Anyway, this is a long way of saying that there are certain ways of the mind working on the internet that don't necessarily, they're not direct influences to me. But I will say to the part of the question about the bodily technologies that, you guys know the book Testo Junkie, Paul Preciado's book, and that book was really, I think I read Testo Junkie probably about halfway through this book, and, I love the way that Preciado talks about, Preciado describes, heterosexual intercourse as a tried and true technology for baby making. You know what I mean? But like everything is like a technology, in kind of Preciado, via Foucault or whatever. But I like when I think about the freedom of the kind of denaturalizing space of thinking about things as technologies, all things, including the most like natural thing, like guys and girls getting it on, it helps me out because I think this kind of dystopic image of like the transsexual as somebody who is taking more advantage of pharmaceutical or surgical technologies than any of us who might identify as a cisgendered person is Preciado really points out how it's a very wrong-headed equation by going through the pill or going through any number of technologies that shape this is straight to like Donna Haraway and the Cyborg Manifesto and all that, but I think it's much more interesting to see the ways in which we're all interpenetrated by technologies of various kinds than it is to isolate, one kind of person and say, do you know that you're deeply interfacing, perhaps in the collaborative way with, the pharmacopornographical industry? And it's like, most trans people will be like, tell me something that I haven't thought about, a lot longer than you have. So I think so I think that's, anyway, yeah.
Can you say a bit more about the technophobia then, please? You said you were technophobic.
Oh, well, like, I don't know, I'm just, it's just so cliche to say, but I just am, I'm just guarded about my time, and I feel like I spend too much time in front of a screen as it is, so I just don't add anything. And certain things, yeah, like all that passed me by. Like there was nothing virtuous about it, it just passed me by. Like, and I kind of had this feeling like, and everyone was like, oh, you're on MySpace or something? And I was like, what's that? And I thought like, oh, this will happen with Facebook too. Like in like a few years, people will be like, oh, Facebook, no one does that anymore either. So I just kind of like, they'll just all keep passing me by. It doesn't seem like that's true with Facebook. It seems like it's had more staying power, but than MySpace. But I just, yeah, they just passed me by. I mean, I think, I'd be curious, Olivia, about is it the very last chapter? It is the very last chapter of the
And I left Facebook straight after I wrote that chapter.
Did you really?
Yeah, that was the end.
I mean, I thought that it was very interesting. I'm very, it's kind of like I don't drink, and since I quit drinking, it's kind of like I have the same enjoyment, like hearing people talk about their drinking or things as I do with hearing people talk about social media or something. Because like it's like a very pleasurable place to like just feel like you can listen to people just fighting this thing out where they're just like, oh my God, I'm so glad, so good you never started, never get on it. Like, you'll never get off it anyway. And I'm just like, okay, I feel like I fielded a lot of really interesting, I know how a lot of people feel about social media in this way that I feel like is very interesting to me, like not doing it. I just can really feel the feelings of other people not doing it. But that's probably why I like that chapter so much. You're...
my nose dive into it.
Yeah, but I do other things. And, so it doesn't matter. It's not like when you're describing waking up, it's very memorable for those of you who've read The Lonely City, just like waking up and the first thing, Olivia saying, like just dragging the Mac into bed and, twittering, like, right, from the very start, just like being greeted by a chorus of thousands of voices first thing in the morning and stuff. I mean, I think it's like, we all have, I think, versions of that these days. But so you quit right after that?
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter, but I quit Facebook. And it was Facebook I felt like was the really toxic space because it felt so sort of toxic in its performances. I wasn't on board for it. I didn't care anymore.
Yeah.
How are we doing for time? One more. It's behind you, sorry. Oh, there's one here too, though. So maybe those two and then we're done.
Thank you. There's a point in the Argonauts where you quote Eileen Myles saying that the dirty secret is it's always been about me. And I wondered if you could talk a tiny bit just about the idea of the dirty secret, kind of in relation to confessional and also New York School, but kind of what constitutes the dirty secret and what is dirt when it's in the public.
Oh,
thank you.
That's great. I think it's Anne Carson, actually, who has a very lovely passage about dirt in her essay, Dirt and Desire, where, because it's local, she says, dirt's she's quoting Mary Douglas, but saying it's very relative. So, like, a piece of egg is dirt in the British Library, but, not elsewhere, so, like, I think, so there's that. But putting that aside, Eileen was talking in that interview about how to not have the shameful badge of it being all about you, that people are always saying, like, well, I'm really writing about the culture, or really, you look at me, but it's a mask, or it's a metaphor. I'm using a voice, and proof rock isn't just about T.S. Eliot's feelings. It's about the whole state of European society, mid-century. It's like it's kind of like, if you just presume that all those things are true, that of course writing about the self will tell you about the culture, and writing about the culture will tell you about the self writing it. If you presume that interplay, I think Eileen she's joking around saying like, oh, I just don't need all that like, I'm not going to sit here and give you a big song and dance. At the same time, Eileen is the first person to have many, many, many inventive metaphors for the way she uses self in her text. She talks about, she's created a character called Eileen Myles that she writes what she calls what she calls autofiction is fiction, with Eileen Myles as the character. who she imagines she'll often say is like like a comic book character, and she's just writing that character in frame by frame. I mean, she has all kinds of ways of talking about her character creation of herself. So I think, but what she's willing to do, in addition to all those interesting conversations about, because, I'm not the self. I mean, each of books of mine that have a first person, I kind of have decided what that first person will sound like. And they're different, I think. I mean, I have like a certain sound, but then there are certain things like Bluets has a kind of a faux scientized, but now we shall talk as if, there's a kind of intellectual distance that I'm pretending. There's other decisions. So, I mean, I think there are lots of interesting conversations one can have about construction of self in autobiography. But I think what Eileen's doing there is just being willing to just own the thing that, I mean, again, it's a queer move. Like before somebody calls you, dirty faggot, you say, no, I'm the dirty faggot. She's just like, oh no, the dirty secret is all about me. Like you're not going to term me with like, but isn't your writing really just all about you? It's like, she's like, I got there first and yesterday. So there's over here.
And first off, I didn't mean to worry because Facebook's become really uncool. So
Great. Okay, good.
Now I've left.
Now Olivia's off it. It died.
I guess my question is kind of about. I mean, I know you primarily through the Argonauts and Bluets, but I also know that you're a poet as well. And I'm curious as to how you approach. I guess it's more about sort of sensibilities and approach. Really. How you approach like a poem and how you would approach writing a book like this. And I suppose it's fitting. This is the last question because when do you know when to stop? Is one of these books for sale started as a poem, or do you know when things kind of end? And,
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, Bluets started as poems, and I just didn't like them. They just seemed really precious. I kept imagining the like coffee table book about like poems about the color blue, and I was like, I just didn't like it. And then when I took away their line breaks, I felt like everything got a lot more. There was just a kind of sense of conflict that I started being able to create. So I think, but that was probably the last book of mine that they had a very direct relationship to like the possibility of a line break. I think. For a long time, poetry was contrary to what these books are like, which are very quote heavy or really, elucidating the trail of one's thinking. The kind of poetry that I liked writing was more like Paul Celan or Robert Creeley, people who I really love the idea of kind of an ordinary language poetry where you could be talking about something very, very complicated, but using like 5 nouns, like apple, Moses, door, whatever, and that you were just kind of marshaling this very plain language. I wasn't like talking about my poet self like she's dead, but like I wasn't in that. I wasn't very interested in like a Baroque or very discursive kind of poetry. So I think in some ways. But poetry to me is very performative. So you're performing something, and when I was writing the book Jane, when it would get more discursive, like I wanted to say something, poetry, my poetry anyway, would break down under the burden of trying to explain something or tell you about the dates or whatever. So that book ended up being kind of half poetry and half prose because there were just certain things I was trying to write as poems. But the poetry couldn't hold, the lyricism just would die, and then I let a lot of the poems in there be very flat, kind of like not good poetry, at the service of making a narrative poem, where individual poems couldn't be taken out and be like good lyric experiences. They would have to be read as part of the narrative. I think that when I wrote that, I began to be, more interested in just in in structure, and I think that since I was not, most of my poems are single page poems. I never could do as many structural, large-scale experiments and say as much, I guess, you know. And I think in some ways prose is so lovely for me because it can be very like poetic, while you're also getting a lot of work done. And I think, yeah, and I don't have an idea what impulse will come next between those, you know. It really just seems like just whatever comes next, you know. Right.
Thank you all very much for your comments and contributions and questions. Thank you for squeezing in. It was a total sellout, I'm delighted to say. So thank you all for squeezing in those hearts. Most of all, thank you, Maggie Nelson and Olivia Laing. Thank you so much.